Imagine stepping into a grand temple in the heart of the ancient world. The scent of burning incense fills the air, chants echo off the stone walls, and men draped in robes speak with the authority of gods. These were the priests, guardians of the sacred, believed to hold the keys to divine mysteries. At their side were oracles, women who were thought to channel the voices of deities themselves, guiding kings, generals, and entire nations with their cryptic prophecies. But behind the veil of sanctity, behind the chants and the solemn rituals, something far darker was unfolding. For while priests and oracles were revered as holy figures, many of them were entangled in a web of forbidden desires, secret initiations, and sexual rituals that today would shock us to our very core. This is not the history written in school books. This is the hidden history that ancient societies buried beneath layers of myth and reverence. Temples that were supposedly pure places of worship often concealed rituals of seduction, coercion, and even abuse, all disguised as acts of piety. The very men and women entrusted with guiding the spiritual life of their people were often the ones leading them into darkness. And as we peel back these layers, you'll see how deeply sexuality was entwined with power, how priests and oracles wielded it as a weapon, as a gateway to the divine, and as a means of control over those who trusted them most. Before we begin unraveling these disturbing truths, let me quickly invite you to subscribe to our channel if you're fascinated by the dark, hidden sides of history. We uncover stories that most historians shy away from, and if you want to join us on this journey through the past's most twisted corners, make sure you hit that subscribe button and like this video. Now, let's step deeper into the shadows of ancient temples. To understand the sexual secrets of priests and oracles, we first need to grasp their immense power in society. In cultures like ancient Greece, Rome, Mesopotamia, and Egypt, religion wasn't just about worship. It was the very backbone of politics, law, and everyday life. The gods were everywhere, in the fields, the sky, the seas, and even the human body. Priests were not just religious figures. They were intermediaries between mortals and the divine. Their word could decide whether an army marched to war, whether a marriage was blessed, or whether a plague was punishment from the gods. The oracles, especially in Greece, held even more mystical sway. Imagine the Oracle of Delphi, a woman seated upon a tripod, inhaling intoxicating vapors that induced trance-like states, her words spilling out in riddles that kings and generals would scramble to interpret. To the ancient world, she was a direct line to Apollo himself. But to us today, her role raises disturbing questions. Who controlled her words? Who interpreted them? And what went on behind the closed doors of the temple? Just conduits of divine wisdom. They were part of a system that intertwined sexuality with sacred duty. In Babylon, temple priestesses were expected to perform sexual rites as part of their service to the goddess Ishtar. These acts weren't seen as sinful. They were framed as holy unions that ensured fertility, prosperity, and divine favor. But in reality, they often blurred into exploitation. And in Greece, rumors swirled around the oracles. Whispers that their trances were manipulated, that their bodies were not just vessels for gods, but for men of power who guarded and managed the temple. Even the revered Oracle of Delphi may not have been as untouchable as we imagine. The deeper you look, the clearer it becomes. Sexuality was not separate from religion in the ancient world. It was embedded in it, and priests and oracles were often the gatekeepers, deciding who could enter, who could participate, and who would be used in the name of ritual. So, when we talk about the darkest sexual secrets of priests and oracles, we're not just talking about hidden scandals. We're talking about an entire system of control, one that merged the most intimate human experiences with the most powerful spiritual authority imaginable. And the question we must ask is this: were these rituals truly divine, or were they simply a mask for human lust and corruption dressed in sacred robes? To truly grasp the darkness hidden in temples, we need to start with Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, and the birthplace of some of the most shocking sexual practices ever recorded. In the city of Babylon, religion and sex were inseparable. At the heart of it all stood the goddess Ishtar, the deity of love, fertility, and war. She was a figure both feared and adored, and her temples became notorious for rituals that blurred the line between devotion and desire. The sacred marriage ritual, known as hieros gamos, was one of the most infamous here. The king himself was expected to sleep with a high priestess of Ishtar to ensure the fertility of the land. This wasn't symbolic. It was a literal sexual act, carried out publicly in the temple's inner sanctum. The people believed that, through this union, the goddess would bless their crops and their people. But while it was wrapped in sacred meaning, at its core, it was a political performance, a spectacle that bound sexuality to divine power and gave rulers an aura of godlike authority. And it didn't stop there. Ancient Greek historian Herodotus claimed that every woman in Babylon was required at least once in her life to visit the temple of Ishtar and submit herself to a stranger. This act, known as sacred prostitution, was framed as an offering to the goddess. A man would throw a coin into the woman's lap, no matter how small the amount, and the ritual would be consummated in the temple grounds. Only after this act could the woman return home. Now, whether Herodotus exaggerated or not, we know that sexual rites were central to Babylonian worship. The temple became not only a house of the gods, but also a place where human bodies were treated as tools of divine will. For the priests who managed these rituals, it was a system of immense control. They dictated the rules, they maintained the sanctity of the acts, and, undoubtedly, they profited from them. From Mesopotamia, let us journey to ancient Egypt, a civilization that placed its pharaohs in the very role of gods. Priests here held staggering influence, controlling not only temples but also vast lands, wealth, and even political power. And in this setting, sexuality wasn't just tolerated, it was sanctified. One of the most shocking tales comes from the cult of Ammon at Thebes. The high priest of Ammon was one of the most powerful men in Egypt, rivaling even the pharaoh. It was whispered that priestesses within his cult engaged in sexual rites designed to channel the fertility of the gods. In some ceremonies, women impersonated goddesses and were expected to perform intimate rituals with priests who embodied their male divine counterparts. These sacred unions were said to maintain cosmic balance. But again, who truly benefited from them? Was it the gods or the priests themselves? Even more disturbing are hints that some oracles in Egypt, women chosen to speak for the gods, were used in ways that stripped them of autonomy. The gods' voices often came through trances or rituals involving intoxicating substances, and once entranced, the oracle could be manipulated. Behind the mask of prophecy, priests could control her words, her actions, and even her body. The fusion of power, sex, and religion was not just spiritual, it was deeply political. By weaving sexual rituals into worship, priests created a system where the most intimate acts were no longer personal choices, but sacred duties. To refuse was to defy the gods themselves, and in ancient societies, few dared risk divine wrath. But perhaps the most chilling part of these rituals is how normalized they were. To the ancient Babylonians, Egyptians, or Greeks, these practices weren't scandals, they were simply part of life. The temple wasn't a place of innocence. It was a stage where sexuality was cloaked in sacred symbolism, and the priests and oracles, hidden behind their robes and rituals, used this system to maintain power not just over the body, but over the soul. As we move forward, we'll see that Greece and Rome took these ideas and twisted them even further. Oracles became pawns, priestesses became symbols of both purity and corruption. And behind closed temple doors, acts were committed that would shock even the most hardened rulers. The deeper we go, the more we uncover just how far these so-called holy figures went in exploiting faith for their darkest desires. When we step into the world of ancient Greece, we encounter a society that openly celebrated both philosophy and passion. The Greeks believed their gods were not distant beings, but exaggerated reflections of humanity itself, driven by love, lust, jealousy, and rage. This worldview shaped the practices of their priests, priestesses, and oracles, and what we find is a disturbing mixture of piety and sensuality. Perhaps the most famous sacred figures in Greece were the Pythia, the oracles of Delphi. These women were chosen to channel the voice of Apollo, the god of prophecy, to the outside world. They were revered, holy vessels of divine wisdom. But behind the veil of incense, smoke, and chanting, the reality was far darker. To prepare for prophecy, the oracle entered a trance, often induced by inhaling intoxicating fumes that rose from a crack beneath the temple. In this state, she would babble incoherent words, and who interpreted those words? The male priests of Apollo. In other words, the oracle was often little more than a figurehead, a woman displayed as the mouthpiece of the gods, but ultimately controlled by men who twisted her words into tools of politics and war. But here's where it turns sinister. Ancient accounts suggest that oracles weren't always free from physical exploitation. Many were chosen as virgins, seen as pure vessels for the gods. Yet over time, scandals arose. Stories spread of oracles being coerced into divine unions, intimate acts that supposedly bound them closer to Apollo. In reality, these encounters served to satisfy priests or wealthy patrons who had access to the temple. The very women who were supposed to embody purity became entangled in webs of power and abuse, all hidden beneath the claim of serving the gods. Greece also had its mystery cults, secret religious societies shrouded in secrecy and ritual. The Eleusinian mysteries, dedicated to Demeter and Persephone, were among the most famous. While the core of these rituals remains unknown, whispers from outsiders accused them of including sexual rites. Some claimed that initiates engaged in symbolic unions, mimicking the fertility of the earth. Whether these accusations were true or exaggerated propaganda, they reveal how common the association between sex and sacred ritual truly was. Moving to Rome, the situation becomes even more disturbing. Roman religion absorbed much of Greece's mythology, but added its own political twist. Priests in Rome were not only spiritual leaders but also politicians, entangled in the ambitions of emperors and senators. And when politics and desire mixed, the result was corruption on an unimaginable scale. One of the most infamous groups was the Vestal Virgins, priestesses of Vesta, goddess of the hearth. These women were chosen as young girls and sworn to 30 years of chastity. Their purity was said to protect Rome itself. But what happened when that purity was broken tells us volumes about Roman hypocrisy. If a Vestal Virgin was accused of losing her virginity, the punishment was horrific. She was buried alive in an underground chamber, left with only a lamp and a few days of food. Rome claimed this was not an execution, but an offering, since spilling a Vestal's blood was forbidden. But while the official punishment was terrifying, rumors swirled that many violations of chastity were not the result of choice, but of exploitation. High-ranking men, protected by power, could force themselves upon a Vestal, leaving the woman to face death while her abuser escaped untouched. In the name of religion, women became both sacred symbols and sacrificial victims. And it didn't stop there. Rome's emperors, especially the more notorious ones, often used religion as a cover for their darkest desires. The Emperor Elagabalus, for example, was both a high priest and a ruler. He introduced shocking sexual practices into the Roman state religion, forcing sacred rituals to resemble little more than debauchery. Ancient sources describe him marrying multiple partners, including men, women, and even a Vestal priestess, acts that horrified Rome not because of morality, but because they desecrated what was supposed to be holy. In Rome, as in Greece, sex and religion were deeply entwined. Temples became spaces where sacred duty could so easily be manipulated into personal indulgence. Priests wielded not just spiritual authority, but intimate control over others' lives. And in many cases, the victims, whether oracles, priestesses, or ordinary worshippers, had little choice but to submit, convinced that refusal meant offending the gods themselves. As shocking as these practices sound, the darkest chapters are still ahead. For when Christianity rose to power and swept across Europe, the very leaders who condemned pagan practices as sinful would themselves become entangled in scandals far worse. The secrets of medieval priests, bishops, and even popes make the corruption of Greece and Rome seem almost tame in comparison. As the ancient world began to shift, the old gods of Greece and Rome slowly lost their grip. In their place rose Christianity, a faith that promised purity, salvation, and the rejection of pagan excess. At least, that was the message preached from the pulpits. But if we dig beneath the surface, we discover that even within this new religion, the darkest sexual secrets still thrived. From its earliest days, Christianity was obsessed with controlling the body. Church leaders declared sex outside of marriage a sin, condemned pagan rituals as immoral, and held up virginity as the highest ideal. Priests were meant to be examples of chastity and holiness. Yet, the very rules designed to enforce purity created fertile ground for corruption and hypocrisy. One of the earliest scandals we find involves the so-called holy men of the desert, the monks and hermits who withdrew from society to prove their devotion. Some were genuinely ascetic, starving themselves and renouncing all pleasure. But others, as accounts from the time suggest, became predators cloaked in robes of holiness. Stories circulated of monks who promised women salvation if they shared their bodies, twisting faith into a weapon of coercion. In one chilling tale, a supposed holy man convinced a young woman that sleeping with him was not a sin, but a test of obedience to God. Her trust was betrayed, her faith shattered, all in the name of religion. By the medieval period, the Catholic Church had established a rigid hierarchy of power. Priests were forbidden to marry, bound by vows of celibacy. On the surface, this made them appear holy, separate from the desires of ordinary men. In reality, it fueled an underground culture of secrecy. Priests took mistresses, fathered children in secret, and used their authority to exploit the vulnerable. Because who would dare question a man who claimed to speak for God? The confessional booth, intended as a place of forgiveness, became, in some cases, a place of manipulation. Historical accounts describe priests who used confession to probe into intimate details of women's lives, and then used that knowledge to seduce or blackmail them. Imagine the fear of a woman who believed her eternal soul was at stake, trapped between shame and obedience. For many, there was no escape, but the scandals didn't stop with ordinary priests. Bishops, cardinals, and even popes became entangled in webs of sexual corruption. Entire chronicles from the Middle Ages describe church officials keeping harems of mistresses, selling church positions for gold, and indulging in orgies behind monastery walls. One bishop in the 11th century was accused of keeping over 50 concubines, flaunting his debauchery while condemning ordinary people for their sins. And then there were the nunneries. Intended as sanctuaries for holy women, many convents became prisons, and sometimes playgrounds for corrupt priests. Nuns were supposed to be brides of Christ, yet scandals erupted when priests secretly visited at night, leaving entire convents pregnant. Some convents became infamous, not for their piety, but for their hidden orgies and forbidden romances. The women inside were trapped, forced to uphold vows they never chose, yet vulnerable to the very men who claimed spiritual authority. What makes these stories so disturbing is the hypocrisy. The church publicly condemns sexuality, calling it sinful and dirty. Yet behind closed doors, some of its most powerful figures indulged in the very acts they outlawed. Worse still, they cloaked their desires in the language of holiness. A priest could tell a frightened young girl that submitting to him was an act of obedience to God, or that refusal would damn her soul. It was spiritual manipulation at its most horrific. By the 10th and 11th centuries, the situation became so widespread that entire church councils were called to address it. The Council of Pavia in 1022, for example, condemned priests for living openly with wives and mistresses. Yet, despite decrees, the scandals never stopped. Every attempt to enforce celibacy seemed only to drive the corruption deeper underground, turning secrecy into a permanent feature of the church's sexual politics. And when we reach the Renaissance, the scandals explode into full view. Popes themselves became infamous for their indulgence. Some fathered children, hosted wild banquets filled with debauchery, and treated the papal palace like a royal harem. These were not hidden rumors whispered in dark corners. They were open secrets that shocked even their contemporaries. Christianity had promised to sweep away the sins of pagan temples, to purify faith and bring people closer to God. Instead, it gave rise to a new kind of scandal, one hidden behind the robes of priests, one excused by the authority of bishops, one crowned by the very man seated on the throne of St. Peter. But before we dive into those infamous papal scandals, perhaps the darkest in all of history, we must look closer at how religion, sex, and power had become inseparable. The very institutions meant to guide souls to heaven were, in many cases, dragging them into the depths of corruption. As Europe entered the Renaissance, the Catholic Church stood as the most powerful institution in the Western world. Popes, crowned emperors, decided the fate of kingdoms, and claimed to hold the keys to heaven itself. From the outside, the papacy projected an image of divine authority, holiness, and moral order. But behind the gilded doors of the Vatican, a very different story was unfolding. One of lust, corruption, and sexual scandal so grotesque that it shocked even the faithful of its own time. To understand how things spiraled so far, we must remember that the papacy was not just a spiritual role, it was a throne. The Pope wasn't simply a holy man. He was also a monarch, a political player, and at times, a ruthless opportunist, who reigned in the early 10th century during a time historians now call the pornocracy. This era was dominated by powerful Roman noble women who controlled the papacy through their influence over the men they bedded. Sergius himself was rumored to have had a long-standing affair with the infamous Marozia. Imagine that. The supposed vicar of Christ was fathered in scandal, the child of a papal affair. But this was only the beginning. For ordinary believers, who had been taught that the Pope was the holiest man alive, the hypocrisy was staggering. Fast forward to the Renaissance, and the scandals reached a new height. Perhaps the most infamous family to ever sit on the papal throne was the Borgias. Rodrigo Borgia, who became Pope Alexander VI in 1492, is remembered less for his religious achievements and more for his shocking indulgence in sex, nepotism, and murder. He openly acknowledged his children, something popes were not supposed to have, and placed them in positions of immense power. His daughter Lucretia and his son Cesare became notorious figures in their own right. Embroiled in rumors of incest, poisonings, contemporary accounts describe a night of shocking debauchery in the Vatican, where 50 courtesans danced naked for the Pope, cardinals, and noblemen. The evening devolved into a contest of sexual endurance, with prizes offered to those who performed the most acts of lust. Whether every detail of this account is true or exaggerated, the fact that such a story could even exist and be believed by contemporaries tells us everything we need to know about the corruption of the time. And then there was Pope Julius II, known as the Warrior Pope. Ironically, Julius was also the Pope who commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling, creating one of the most iconic religious artworks in history. Perhaps even more shocking was Pope Sixtus IV, who reigned in the late 15th century. Sixtus was rumored to have sanctioned the establishment of brothels in Rome, collecting taxes from prostitution to fill the papal treasury. He was also accused of nepotism of the most scandalous kind, elevating his young male relatives to positions of power amid allegations of sexual favoritism. The papal court under Sixtus was said to be a hotbed of vice, where wealth and indulgence triumphed over any semblance of holiness. The most devastating part of these scandals was not merely that popes and priests sinned, but that they cloaked their actions in the robes of holiness. The faithful were told to obey, to remain pure, to fear eternal damnation. Yet those at the very top indulged in forbidden pleasures, sometimes more shamelessly than the pagan priests the Church had once condemned. The impact was enormous, or if it had become a corrupt institution, devoted only to wealth and lust. By the early 16th century, this disillusionment would ignite into a firestorm. The Protestant Reformation, but before that revolution shook Christendom, the Vatican would continue to hide its darkest secrets. Behind the grandeur of its cathedrals and the beauty of its art, the papal palace remained a place where faith and flesh collided in ways both shocking and unforgettable. By the early 16th century, the papacy had become a lightning rod for criticism. Ordinary Christians whispered about the corruption in hushed voices, while scholars, preachers, and even some priests began to speak out more boldly. The stories of popes hosting debauched banquets, fathering illegitimate children, and surrounding themselves with mistresses and lovers were no longer secrets. They were scandals openly discussed across Europe. One of the most glaring issues was the Church's hypocrisy. Priests were sworn to celibacy, yet countless records describe them keeping concubines, visiting brothels, or even preying on the very people they were supposed to guide. Bishops and cardinals lived in luxury, flaunting wealth and mistresses, while ordinary peasants struggled to survive. The papacy's sexual scandals had become symbolic of the Church's broader moral collapse. It was within this context that Martin Luther, a German monk, famously launched his protest against indulgences in 1517. While indulgences, the selling of forgiveness, were his immediate concern, Luther also raged against the moral corruption of the clergy. He condemned priests who used confessionals to seduce women, bishops who fathered illegitimate children, and popes who lived more like kings than holy men. For reformers like Luther, the sexual sins of the papacy were indeed just personal failings. They were evidence that the entire Church had lost its divine legitimacy. One striking example of this tension was Pope Leo X, the Medici Pope, who reigned during Luther's revolt. Though not as scandalous as Alexander VI, Leo was still accused of surrounding himself with young male companions, indulging in excess, and treating the papacy like a stage for personal enjoyment rather than sacred duty. His critics saw him as the epitome of what the papacy had become: worldly, decadent, and blind to its spiritual decay. but the scandals went deeper than the popes themselves. In convents across Europe, whispers of illicit affairs between nuns and priests shocked the faithful. Tales spread of abbesses who acted more like queens, inviting noble patrons, and sometimes their lovers into cloistered walls. In monasteries, 2 accusations of sodomy and abuse surfaced, particularly in Italy and Germany. At the same time, the Vatican tried to silence its critics. Reformers who exposed clerical immorality were branded heretics, sometimes executed. Their words burned alongside their bodies, yet the truth was impossible to suppress. The very spiritual leader who was supposed to embody holiness had become a figure of ridicule, a symbol of sin, lust, and corruption. One particularly scandalous pamphlet from the era accused Pope Alexander VI and his children of incest. Whether true or exaggerated, these accounts spread like wildfire, damaging the papacy's reputation beyond repair. Imagine being a peasant in Germany or France, seeing images of the Pope God's representative on earth, mocked as a lecherous tyrant surrounded by naked courtesans. Even within the Vatican itself, secret stories circulated. There were whispers of priests conducting initiation rituals that blurred the line between religion and sexual exploitation. Some scholars argue that these tales may have been exaggerated by enemies of the Church, but their persistence shows how deeply people believed in the corruption of the clergy. And so, as Luther's protest grew into a full-fledged Reformation, the scandals of the papacy became fuel for the fire. Every affair, every illegitimate child, every whispered rumor of debauchery was held up as proof that Rome had abandoned God. Reformers declared that salvation could no longer be found through such a corrupt institution. The Catholic Church, of course, fought back. It launched the Counter-Reformation, trying to clean house and restore its image. New orders like the Jesuits were founded to enforce stricter discipline, and the Council of Trent condemned many of the abuses that had been tolerated for centuries. Yet, even as the Church tried to reform, it could not erase the centuries of scandal that had already stained its legacy. What makes this story so haunting is not simply that priests, bishops, and popes sinned. After all, no human being is perfect. They preached purity while practicing corruption, demanded obedience while exploiting the vulnerable, and promised salvation while living in sin. This hypocrisy left scars that have never fully healed. Even today, the Vatican grapples with the shadow of its past, as modern scandals echo the sins of centuries before. The difference now is that nothing can remain hidden for long. But before we jump ahead to modern times, we must uncover the final and most unsettling layer of this story: the secrets that were buried, the scandals that never made it into official records, and the whispered rumors that revealed just how entangled sex, power, and religion truly were in the long, dark history of the papacy. While some scandals of the papacy exploded into the open, paraded in pamphlets, whispered in taverns, and used as weapons by the Reformation, many others remained buried beneath centuries of secrecy. These are the stories we know only through hints, rumors, and half-erased chronicles. Yet sometimes it is these hidden tales that are the most disturbing. One such set of stories revolves around the Vatican archives themselves. For centuries, rumors spread that locked away in the dark chambers beneath St. Peter's lay documents too scandalous to ever be released. Priests wrote letters confessing sins of the flesh. Bishops sent reports about their rivals' affairs. And papal officials quietly catalogued whispers of orgies, affairs, and even darker practices. Secrets that, if revealed, could have toppled thrones and shattered faith. We may never know the full truth of what those archives contain, but hints survive. In 1497, a papal notary recorded that Alexander VI, already infamous for his decadence, held feasts where courtesans were hired to dance naked for cardinals. Later accounts claimed that his son Cesare Borgia, the ruthless duke and warlord, joined his father in competitions of seduction, bedding noblewomen and commoners alike under the roof of the Vatican. These tales were passed down with a mixture of horror and fascination, blurring the line between fact and legend. Another chilling whisper concerns Pope Julius III, who reigned in the mid-16th century. Known for his taste in luxury, Julius shocked many by elevating a teenage boy named Innocenzo to the rank of cardinal. Innocenzo was uneducated, had no qualifications for the role, and was widely believed to be the Pope's lover. Their relationship scandalized Europe. Satirists mocked the Pope, calling Innocenzo his monkey, and rumors swirled about the unnatural intimacy between them. Though the Vatican tried to bury the story, it lingered as one of the most notorious examples of how power and desire could intertwine in the papacy. Equally unsettling are the stories of priests and monks who used spiritual authority to manipulate those who sought guidance. Confession, meant to be a sacred act of cleansing, sometimes became a tool of exploitation. There are documented cases where priests seduced women in the confessional, claiming absolution could only be given through physical intimacy. In other instances, young novices were told that obedience to their superiors required submitting to sexual acts. Such abuses were rarely written down officially, but the echoes survive in accusations, rumors, and satirical works that circulated among the people. And then there are the stories that tread into the realm of the forbidden. Some Renaissance critics accuse certain popes and cardinals of engaging in occult practices, mixing sexuality with rituals that blurred the line between religion and magic. Whispers told of priests using aphrodisiacs and hallucinogens during ceremonies, of orgiastic rites disguised as divine mysteries, and of women kept as oracular vessels for prophecy through sexual trance. Whether these were exaggerated slanders or half-hidden truths, they reveal how deeply people associated the papacy with forbidden sexuality. It wasn't only men who were implicated, powerful women within the church's orbit, noble women tied to the papal court, mistresses of cardinals, even abbesses of wealthy convents became infamous for their own scandals. Some convents were rumored to be less about prayer and more about aristocratic intrigue, where secret lovers visited cloistered nuns by night. An Italian chronicle from the 16th century even accuses certain convents of functioning as hidden brothels for wealthy patrons. These may not have been widespread, but the rumors stuck, further feeding the image of a church consumed by lust. Perhaps the darkest scandals are those that leave no names, only shadows. Whispers of children born in secret and spirited away. Priests accused of predatory behavior moved quietly from one post to another to avoid exposure. Murmurs of violent acts covered up with silence and bribes. While these stories echo eerily with modern headlines, they remind us that abuses of power have deep roots in history. The most haunting part of these hidden scandals is not their sensational detail, but their invisibility. For every affair that became public, there were likely dozens that remained hidden. For every pope whose name was dragged through the mud, countless lower-ranking clerics escaped scrutiny. And for every victim whose story survived in rumor, many more disappeared into silence. When we look back at these centuries of secrecy, a troubling picture emerges. The papacy was not just an institution of faith, but an institution of control. Sexuality became a tool of power, and power became a shield against accountability. The line between holy and profane blurred, until the Vatican itself became, in the eyes of many, a place where divine authority masked human desire. But history has a way of revealing what institutions try to bury. Scandals that were whispered in the 15th or 16th centuries resurface, now in documents, letters, and the memories of critics who refused to stay silent. The shadows of the past refused to stay hidden forever. And so we arrive at the final chapter of this dark journey, the lasting consequences. How did these scandals shape the image of the papacy for centuries to come? How did they influence art, literature, and the very way people thought about religion and sexuality? And most of all, what lessons do they leave for us today? As we reach the end of this journey through the darkest and most intimate scandals of the papacy, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The papacy was not just a spiritual throne, but also a stage where human desires, ambitions, and corruptions played out on a scale as grand as the Vatican itself. For centuries, popes were seen as God's representatives on earth, men cloaked in holiness, wielding unmatched influence over kings, empires, and the faithful. Yet behind the solemn ceremonies, the incense-filled chapels, and the marble halls of power, another story was unfolding, a story of temptation and indulgence, of forbidden relationships, of hidden sins that undermined the very sanctity the papacy claimed to embody. The consequences of these scandals rippled far beyond the walls of the Vatican. Ordinary believers, upon hearing whispers of papal debauchery, began to question the moral authority of the Church. If the Pope himself, the so-called Vicar of Christ, was entangled in lust, corruption, and scandal, what did that mean for the Church's teachings on purity, marriage, and sin? These doubts were not mere gossip. They became fuel for movements that would forever change history. The Protestant Reformation, for instance, was not born in a vacuum. Figures like Martin Luther saw in the corruption of Rome the ultimate proof that the church had strayed from its divine mission. The sale of indulgences, the wealth of the clergy, and the sexual scandals of popes and priests all gave reformers ammunition. Pamphlets mocking the Vatican spread like wildfire, often filled with lurid stories of papal orgies and priestly misconduct. The intimate scandals of the papacy thus became more than moral failings. They became weapons in a war for the soul of Christianity. Artists and writers also immortalized these scandals, weaving them into satire, literature, and rumor that has survived the centuries. Renaissance poets mocked holy fathers who sired illegitimate children. Playwrights turned papal mistresses and bastard sons into characters of intrigue and betrayal. Even centuries later, the image of the corrupt, lustful pope remained etched into the cultural imagination, a reminder that holiness and humanity can clash in shocking ways. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of these scandals is the lesson they teach about power. Time and again, we see how unchecked authority, wrapped in divine legitimacy, allowed abuses to flourish. The papacy became an institution where secrecy shielded misconduct, and where the allure of absolute power invited absolute corruption. Whether it was the notorious banquet of the chestnuts, the whispered lovers of Julius III, or the buried abuses of nameless priests, the pattern remained the same. Power without accountability breeds scandal. And yet, in a paradox almost too great to comprehend, the papacy endured. Despite centuries of exposure, criticism, and rebellion, the institution survived. St. Peter's Basilica still stands, the Vatican still commands attention, and the Pope remains a figure of influence in the modern world. But the shadow of history lingers. Every new revelation of corruption or abuse echoes the past, reminding us that the scandals of medieval and Renaissance popes were not aberrations, they were warnings. The darkest, intimate secrets of the papacy teach us that even the most sacred institutions are vulnerable to human weakness. They remind us that behind the robes and rituals, those in power are still flesh and blood, subject to the same temptations as the people they rule. And they force us to ask, how many secrets still remain hidden, locked away in the Vatican's archives, waiting for history to unearth them? Perhaps the most chilling thought of all is this. For every scandal we know, for every pope whose sins were dragged into the light, there are likely countless others that vanished into silence, buried by time, destroyed by the church, or forgotten by history. And so, as we step away from this exploration of forbidden papal history, one truth should stay with us. Power and secrecy make dangerous companions, and when desire, sanctity, and authority collide, the result can be scandals so dark they haunt humanity for centuries. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the hidden past. If you found this story as shocking and eye-opening as I did, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss more tales of history's forbidden, forgotten, and disturbing side. Until next time, remember, the past is never as pure as it seems.